again, I can't answer for everyone, right? But personally for me, I do need this at least cautious optimism so that I can envision this future where I want to live, where we can live, where we've solved issues like biodiversity loss and we've addressed issues related to climate change. And starting then from this desirable future and thinking about, okay, how do we get there? And working towards it. And then for me, as long as I know that I'm trying to work towards it, it helps keep that optimism. Because it can be kind of hard.
Hello and welcome to the Deadbeat Philosophy Podcast. I'm Dave Baumeister. We're here today before a live audience in the basement, the cellar of the Museum Hegel-Haus here in Stuttgart, because what better place to talk philosophy and ideas than the basement of a dead philosopher. So, and today I'm going to be joined by a guest, Kristen Jakstis, from the University of Stuttgart. But first, I'd like to call up here Marie from the city of Stuttgart in the Museum Hegel-Haus to say a quick couple words. So welcome, everybody.
Also, a warm welcome from my side. David and Kristen are today gonna do a live recording of the Deadbeat Philosophy Podcast. And in this live recording, the two are gonna discuss their collaborative project, Stories for a Better Future. At the heart of the conversation lies the human relationship to the future, caught between ecological crisis, urban life, and philosophical reflection on nature and time. I'm really excited to hear you two, and enjoy, everyone.
Now, at first, I said a live audience, and I got to say I was actually kind of like a little bit fibbing there. We didn't have much, but now we do have an audience.
A real audience.
A real audience. So let's hear it from the audience. Okay, all right. Very good. Okay, Kristen, how are you doing today?
Good. Very happy to be here on this super, super cold Saturday morning.
Yes, yeah. I think this is maybe the coldest Saturday of the year thus far. I don't know if you guys feel that way. So I see some scarves. So I didn't break out my scarf yet or my hats, but I'm kind of right on the cusp. I think now it's got there. Are you a hat and scarf person?
Mine are out. I'm wearing them every day already. Okay. Yes, definitely. Hat, scarf, gloves. I'm originally from California, so I'm not used to the cold.
Okay, yeah.
But I really like winter, so I'm also happy to break out the hats and the scarves.
Okay, very good. Are you from more northern or more southern California?
Oh, I feel like this is a contentious question.
Yes.
But I'm from Southern California, so a city called Thousand Oaks. It's a little bit north of Los Angeles. Our winters are not like this. So it took some getting used to.
Okay. Say more about that. Like why, we're both Americans living in Germany and then in Stuttgart in particular. And we're going to get into the overlaps in our work and our projects together and things, but just like, sometimes I'm at the grocery store and then I hear like an American accent. And I look at that person, I'm like, and especially if they look like they live there, they're not. They're not wearing like a baseball cap or going just to a game or something, but they're getting groceries. And then I'm like, why are you here? Like, what brought you here? There's a lot of people have military backgrounds, and there's that in the history of American relationships with Stuttgart. But tell us your story. Like, what brought you to Germany and then into Stuttgart in particular?
Yeah, so I came to Germany originally on a Fulbright scholarship. So I was teaching English in Fulda for, let's say, 6 or 7 months. And then it was in between the time of my bachelor and my master's studies. And then I was looking at, I know I want to do a master's. I know I want to do it in like environmental science or forest science or something like this. And I was looking at programs then in the US and programs in Germany. And there were very good programs in both locations. And then I looked, and to study forest science in Freiburg, I needed to pay, I think, 1,700 euros a semester compared to, what it is in the US. Much more than that, we can say. So then it was a very easy decision for me to stay in Germany, also study something that I was very passionate about. So I studied forest science, actually, with a focus on biodiversity and wildlife in Freiburg, and stayed there then for 2.5 years or so. And then moved to Stuttgart to start my current position now at the University of Stuttgart in Leonie Fischer's lab at the Institute for Landscape Planning and Ecology. So I kind of came here thinking that I would only be in Germany for a few months, And then it grabbed me and it stuck, and I'm very happy that I'm here still.
Yes.
So.
Very nice. No, that's good. And that's, I think that's like a credit to the German university system. Like there's always critiques that can be had of any university system, like there's a lot of problems. But one, the subsidization of tuition that makes education accessible in Germany is something that I think is very, hopefully, I don't know if the average German taxpayer feels that's a good investment or use of dollars. I'm sure there's some who don't feel that way, but it's a nice contrast with the US, especially where doing important work on topics like this, there's often not as much support as you'd initially think, you know what I mean? So you need to find a place where you feel at home in that. And let me ask this then. So it's like, okay, let's transition to forestry, to the environment, and to with a mind of Germany and the U.S. as well. So like my background in philosophy and in the humanities, and in particular in the history of questions around the environment and the human's relationship to nature. And so when I'm kind of floating through the space of my life and living in a city and teaching and maybe working and writing on philosophy, I'm kind of thinking about, how are we humans positioned in our world and what kind of ideas are floating through our heads and what's, how is that impacting the government or things like this. So I'm kind of focused on, let's say, the ideas and the history that goes into that relationship. How would you describe, based on kind of your background, your discipline, and you're also very interdisciplinary, like your many disciplines, like what do you think about when you navigate the world through your eyes and through your glasses?
Through my real glasses here. Yes. So for example, now I really work with topics that have to do with urban ecology and urban socioecology, also thinking about how people interact with nature in cities and what this means for human-nature relationships. And when I walk through the city, so even through Stuttgart, for example, my eyes always go to whatever nature that I can find, even if it's like, let's say, ecologists like to call that what other people might call weeds, spontaneous vegetation, right? So even if it's like spontaneous vegetation coming out of cracks, I really like to see the flowers and how they interact then with different facades. And I get so excited when I'm walking around the city, and I'm also like observing the people when it's very clear that they notice something and they have an interaction with nature. If it's like looking at a red squirrel on a tree and pointing at it and laughing and saying how cute it is. Or, sometimes, of course, you see less, let's say, positive nature interactions in cities. Maybe you see people running from wasps in the summer or swatting them away. So those make me less happy. But I get very excited to see just how people might be interacting with nature, even in cities when it doesn't feel like super, let's say, pristine natural environments, right? So I like to see how we still interact with these natural elements also in what are very built up areas like here in Stuttgart.
Yeah, great. I wonder, let's see, what that I think raises a lot of really interesting questions just about your unique position in, let's say, like the broader environmental field of focusing on these topics. And so you mentioned cities and how people, even in the city, so we tend to think of cities and kind of built artificial human spaces as the opposite of nature. We're literally like excluding nature. When people think of nature, they often think of wilderness or of maybe of kind of green landscapes, maybe farmland, but beyond the city itself. We don't think about buildings. We don't think about sidewalks. We usually don't think even about parks in cities, which tend to be very rectangular and kind of built in the city almost, as an appendage of the city and not nature in their own right. So we have a long history of thinking about what humans do in cities as against nature and contrary to nature and outside of nature. And I imagine even in the history of the discipline of forestry, for instance, there's a bias towards, well, forests are beyond the city, right, or something. Or so the whole idea of then urban forestry and of doing this kind of work on natural spaces and on plant life and on human-nature interactions in the city, in some ways it seems oxymoronic or paradoxical. Like traditionally that it shouldn't even be possible, but then yet it is, I guess. So could you speak a little bit to that? Is and maybe just, because I'm somebody who's like very old-fashioned, I'm like, oh, this seems so novel, and like, how is this, is that unusual in your discipline to focus on nature and urban environments? And what do you think of all that?
I mean, I think it's gaining more and more attention, both in research and in teaching, because, right, the majority of humanity already lives in cities, and more people are moving to cities with urban densification, right? So at least from, let's say, the research and the academic side, then we can say that there has been an interest then in understanding how people are interacting with nature within cities, because one, the majority of people live here. Two, there are a lot of benefits associated with human-nature interaction or strong human-nature relationships. So like related to supporting aspects of mental health or physical health, or I don't know, encouraging situations for social interaction, developing this strong sense of nature connectedness, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of benefits that can be associated with nature interaction. But people are generally interacting less with the natural environment around them, so like with plants and animals. And this is something that's actually called the extinction of experience. And urbanites, so people who are living in urban areas, are also more likely to interact less with the natural environment around them. So now there's this attention to specifically studying urban nature and human nature interactions in urban areas to learn how we can facilitate meaningful human nature interactions also in cities, so that we can benefit from these interactions too, right? So that we can support the health and well-being of people.
Okay.
So I'd say there's actually like a growing research attention on specifically urban nature, the role of urban nature, the many different ways that it can benefit people in specifically cities and other types of urban areas.
Okay. And so you mentioned like health benefits. There's maybe like kind of broader benefits in terms of consciousness raising for the population. And like, let's see, like right now we're at a museum, the Hegel-Haus Museum, which is operated by the city of Stuttgart, right, and such. And so like, and we live in Stuttgart. Maybe would you, and then we can talk about our, the project we're doing this semester that kind of brings this together from our different angles and stuff. But like, would you give us a couple more concrete examples, maybe from Stuttgart, that would maybe illustrate a little bit of what you're talking about? I don't know if in your research, which particular regions and localities you've mostly focused on, but if any examples come to mind, yeah, please concretize for us.
Yeah, sure. So my research also does focus in Stuttgart or on Stuttgart in some cases, right? I also look at more European broad views and global views, but I have conducted some studies specifically in Stuttgart, two of which are included in my dissertation, which I'm defending on Wednesday. So wish me luck.
Exactly. We'll let you know if she passes. It's kind of a 50-50.
Yeah, fingers crossed. But I conducted two Stuttgart-specific studies then. So one was looking at how two different types of human-nature interactions might impact mental health. So in this case, we looked at depression risk. And in this study, we found that people who engaged in urban gardening had a decreased odds of depression risk. So there's evidence then from this study that urban gardeners, or engaging in urban gardening, where you have this high engagement with natural elements, right? You touch soil and plants, you can smell it, you see it, maybe even you taste it when you harvest it and cook it, right? So this high engagement human nature interaction of urban gardening was associated with the decreased odds of depression risk in our Stuttgart population. But what I found really interesting was that the frequency of visiting green spaces wasn't associated with depression risk. So people who visited, for example, urban parks very often, so I think it was more than 3 times a week or something, there was no association then between this human nature interaction variable and depression risk.
Okay.
So then I followed this up with a second Stuttgart study where I actually then was thinking, okay, so if there isn't an association between visiting parks, for example, and depression risk, what are people actually doing in parks? Are they engaging in these other sorts of high engagement human nature interactions, right? So are they touching plants? Are they collecting things? Are they like actively observing birds or something, right? So then I conducted another study, actually in winter. I mentioned that I'm a little bit obsessed with winter, or that I enjoy German winters, where I actually sat out in parks in Stuttgart during the winter and actually observed what people were doing. And I observed 13,000 people in Stuttgart's parks in the winter.
Were you like camouflaged, like, or up in the tree kind of?
I think I'm just kind of a naturally camouflaged kind of person, because I was really sitting there like with my clipboard and like a timer and like really watching what people were doing. And I think over the course of 2.5 months, only one person asked me what I was doing.
Okay.
And I was really in a lot of different spots in 3 different parks, like, and I guess I'm just naturally camouflaged, or like give off the vibe of like, no, don't talk to me.
Exactly. They just figured you're doing something, but they don't want to know what. Yeah, the anonymity of the park or of the city still extends there. So, yeah, exactly. So what did you find? What was your, after all that kind of close observation? Like, what are people actually doing in the park? It seems they're visiting the park then doesn't have this immediate or this kind of connected health benefit that urban gardening does. So but they're going there, they're around, trees, squirrels, they're in a natural space. What did you find?
So actually I have to add the caveat that there are other studies that find, for example, connection with visiting green spaces associated with other mental health disorders. It was just in the Stuttgart case study that we didn't find this.
It's just a Stuttgart thing. Yeah,
maybe it's just a Stuttgart thing. I personally think it probably does have something to do with this level of engagement with natural elements, but this question remains to be answered still. But in the parks, actually, I'd say, I actually remember 2.4% of park visitors engaged in these, let's say, more high engagement human-nature interactions with natural elements. So not so many. But you have to also think it was winter time, right? So the seasonality is also definitely going to impact this. But it was really cool to see the different ways that people engaged with nature, and ways that I didn't expect either, and that I might not have gotten if I had just done a survey-based study or interviews and asked people, hey, what do you do when you visit parks? Because, for example, I saw so many people like stop by this one crabapple tree, and they would just look at it, and they would talk to their friends very loudly about like how beautiful the crab apples are with like the frost hanging on it. And so I saw these really unique human nature interactions as well that I probably wouldn't have learned about otherwise. Also in this study, just 2 more findings I'll share. We found that the odds of this sort of high engagement nature interaction were actually higher at sites with ponds than those without ponds. Right? So thinking about how different landscape elements within our green spaces and different diversity of landscape elements might also impact how we interact with nature. Right?
Okay. So then not just green spaces, but also blue spaces in a sense, right? Like
exactly.
the water element.
Yeah, so these blue spaces integrated within our green spaces.
Okay.
So that was an interesting finding. And just one more that I think is also very relevant is that we found that people who were visibly using technology also had this lower odds of high engagement nature interaction. So people that were talking on the phone, looking at it, texting, even just like wearing AirPods or something, had a lower odds of interacting with the nature around them. Which then maybe also taps into these sensory aspects as well, right? So maybe their senses, their thoughts are elsewhere, even though they're in a green space, right?
Totally. Yeah, then it's like if you're, and I do this a lot myself, where it's like walking while listening to something, and you're kind of zoned out, thinking about what you're going to do. And then it's effectively, in that case, it could be the park is just a sidewalk that happens to have trees nearby, or it's kind of indistinguishable in your own experience. Of course, there's maybe visual elements you're navigating, but there's a sense of maybe the senses need to take it all in. I know, like in phenomenology and what's sometimes called eco-phenomenology, it's a subfield in philosophy that really focuses on the lived experience of human beings, and that we need to kind of really stressing the sense that humans are living, breathing, human animal creatures with our 5 senses, and we're meshed in our environments and our worlds, wherever we are, even in a hyper-urbanized space or on a spaceship or something. We are these, for now at least, until our consciousnesses get uploaded into the broader AI bubble space and stuff, and we no longer have bodies. But so long as we do have bodies, we are these sensory creatures, and there's a lot to be said. Also in terms of course, human evolution and the fact that, how humans evolved the bodies and the sensory apparatuses that we do in environments that, say, have trees and landscapes. I know, as someone who's often depressed and stuff, and who thinks about this as well and tries to find ways to address that, I cultivate cacti, like succulents at home, and I think so. Maybe there's something that just brainstorming here about activity and cultivation in that interaction, because if the park is just purely passive or static to you, it's kind of like a background. It could be a hologram that's just generated, and you're in an AI or an augmented reality world wearing goggles, and you're just going through the park. And I wonder, that'd be an interesting test. Can a augmented reality visit to the park and making those experiences still have the positive impact? But if it's just purely passive, you're not connecting with it through your senses. It's kind of not permeating and penetrating you in a way. But if you see the nature that's there, whether that's like wild nature, or you think, the level of the climate or of the cosmos, big, huge processes, or a volcano or something, or, a cactus or a squirrel in the park. But if you see them as kind of active, that they have something that you can, it's like a back and forth. You can, in the case of the cactus, I can water it and cultivate it, and it can grow, and it does its own thing. So maybe there's a certain openness to that in this idea of interaction that is maybe necessary to actually have an experience of nature, rather than nature just being another decoration, like hung on the wall.
Exactly, right? These more relational values.
Yeah. So, do you what's your house like? Do you have a lot of plants? Do you have any pets? Do you see that you have in your own lived experience these human nature interactions?
I definitely have a lot of human nature interactions in my day-to-day life, and I'm trying to be better about growing plants, but I kill everything. And it's terrible. I'm an ecologist. I love gardening. And this was my first opportunity. I recently moved to Esslingen, so I have a little bit more space. I finally have a balcony. I haven't had a balcony since I've lived here. So it was really nice to get to at least try to grow some tomatoes and stuff. The tomatoes went well. All my houseplants I killed, which maybe this is giving me a negative relationship with nature, but I don't think so. I will continue to try to grow these plants. I think I care for them too much, and then I overwater, and I try to move them around because I know okay, you need half sun plant, but here it's either really sunny or really shady, so then I move it halfway through the day, from the sun into the shade, and I don't know. This was a really long rant on, yes, I have a lot of human nature interactions. No, I'm not very good at gardening or keeping things alive.
Sure. Yeah, but death's part of nature too. You know what I mean? It's that's a meaningful interaction as well, right? If you kind of nurse a plant to a certain state of health and then it perishes, and you kind of observe it, despite your best efforts, it's almost, this can happen with other humans and with other animals and stuff. So the experience of the death of the plant and it being meaningful for you is still a substantial interaction. Whereas, you go through the park and it's just the trees are shedding their leaves, or it's a gardener's trimming this or that. This is alive, this is dead. If it's just this kind of static video game background, it doesn't have any kind of substance to it. But even your dead, shriveled houseplant is has
rest in peace.
Has meaning. Yes. Mm-hmm. Did you bury it, or I don't know?
It got composted.
Okay. Well, that's a form of burial, right? Yeah. So.
But no, that's a good point, right? With the parks, it's just our urban nature is a way that we just consider it often as a backdrop to our experiences, right? Mm-hmm. So this is also something that we want to do with our work, right? Is figuring out how to activate these places and create opportunities then for these also high engagement nature interactions around the city, and maybe not just with your houseplant that may or may not survive your care.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yeah. But can that be scaled up?
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. And what can we do to scale this up?
Mm-hmm. So. Wonderful. Okay, let's pivot. So we are this semester, along with a couple other faculty members at the university, involved in a interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary project called Stories for a Better Future. That very much connects with what we've just been talking about. Maybe would you give us the nutshell of what, in your view, we're doing and why we're doing it?
Sure, yeah. So this semester we're doing an interdisciplinary project or workshop series called Stories for a Better Future. And basically we're working with a group of very diverse students looking at exactly this, right? Thinking about ways that we can use stories and storytelling more broadly to help us create visions for a better future, but also achieve a better future, right? Like using stories to create a future that we actually want to live in, right? Because a lot of times in our work and our day-to-day life, the visions of the future might appear very bleak. So at least for me personally, I work a lot with topics that have to do with biodiversity loss and climate change, and I'm confronted with this in my daily life every day. And I'm sure a lot of other people feel the same way. So this is an opportunity then to step away from this bleak future and actually think about, okay, what do we want then, right? And how can we achieve this? And how can we use stories to help us achieve these futures that we want to live in? So we're actually taking then students from 3 different seminars from 3 different disciplines. So we have my students from architecture and urban planning, but they're doing an urban ecology sort of eco-storytelling course with me this semester. So we have these architecture students. We have your students from philosophy, and your course is on Hobbes and Rousseau this semester?
Exactly.
Okay,
Yeah,
whew, good.
You got it.
And then also the students from a 3rd colleague of ours, Felix Heidenreich, and they are, oh, I hear some giggles. Does anyone know him? Okay. And his students of political science, he's teaching a course this semester on the power of political myth. So then we're bringing together these 3 different disciplines and all of these different perspectives, and then through various formats throughout the semester, we're exploring different ways that stories can help us achieve a better future.
Mm-hmm. Yes, or can get in the way of a better future. You know,
or
so
it
it's
can
like
be dangerous.
Yes, so
exactly.
Great. Yeah, and we have we're doing a film screening of Princess Mononoke, the Hayao Miyazawa. Or the anime film, and we have an event at the Kunstlerhaus where we're going to be talking about ecology and art and looking at an exhibition there and discussing it. And then we've tried to bring the students together to talk with one another a little bit about these topics. So it's kind of, we're just, you know, I think what's unique about what we're doing is that we all believe, it's almost like in the background we recognize, yeah, this is important in each of our disciplines, and we can see the relevance of this and why it would be good to try to think about our disciplines together, like in terms of ideas and politics and urban spaces and design and architecture, and that there's a spectrum there. But that's not always apparent for the students, and maybe also in the broader world of where things get very compartmentalized. And students this is another kind of view of the German university system. There's a lot of differences between, say, the US or North American systems, whereby students tend to be more siloed in Germany in that their university experience is almost entirely within their own institute. So it's kind of, they decide what they want to study, and then they get a lot about that, and their kind of experience is structured. So there aren't actually that many opportunities for students from different, you know, majors or disciplines to meet with each other, not just socially, but to see that, well, the work that we're doing is actually has a lot of overlap. So I think I came from like a liberal arts background in the U.S. and such, where there's often a lot of that kind of soupy mixing of things, you know what I mean? And my view of philosophy is also very porous and mixy, so I really like that we're doing this. So, but let me ask this. Okay, storytelling, stories. There's good stories, there's bad stories. There's powerful stories, there's weak stories. And stories are kind of everywhere in terms of narratives, what we tell about ourselves, the meaning we make in our lives, how we understand others and what they're doing. There's also this sort of past, present, future element in storytelling that you kind of plot, well, what we're doing this, we used to do this, now we're doing this, then this is going to happen in the future. And often embedded in these stories, which we can think of as myths, or you can think about as accounts. There's a whole spectrum of different ways of thinking about this storytelling, but it often shapes how how we go into the future in terms of our feelings as a collective political body with regards to what's possible, whether we should be optimistic or pessimistic, whether we, and say around the environmental crisis. I mean, you could think about storytelling in any number of different domains, but our focus on nature, the human-nature relationship, and the environment, then particular stories about who humans are, how we live, what we've done, what we should do, that depending on what stories are dominant and what stories are prevailing and what stories have influence and what stories kind of catch on, then kind of what happens with the next steps of decision making. How do we vote as citizens? How do we get active in our communities to try to make a difference? How do we, just the very sense of is the future going to be better or worse? So with that kind of very vague kind of opening of like what storytelling could be. And then maybe I'll add in the mix like philosophy for some who like philosophy people who might be listening. You might be like, okay, that goes maybe in people's, I think, sense of themselves in the city and maybe like, literature, but like philosophy is not a story, right? This is like, you make arguments, you convince people rationally that this is the way it should be done. And to that, I would just say that I think even that is a story. Like we have a story about rational argument, and we have a story about, civic discourse, or a story about the role of theory and the power of philosophical thinking to, influence the world or to make correct decisions. That's also all on a certain level a story. And so the frame really covers it all. But I'll say some more about maybe this types of storytelling then that are of interest to me in the project as a philosopher and for my class. But first I want to ask you, what type of stories then, when you think about this question of storytelling in your discipline, maybe in your seminar in particular, but I know you could speak about it more generally if you'd like. Like, what would be an example of in your view, a bad story, one that is that's kind of would push us in the wrong direction, and I think there are a lot of those around. And then what would be an example of a good story?
Mm-hmm. Oof.
Yeah, I tend to do this.
Yeah, so I can think of examples from, let's say, the greater sort of ecological discourse, but I think I will rather go with a couple of examples from the course that I'm teaching, so the seminar. It's actually called Storyscapes, and in this course we have a particular focus on magical creatures and the stories attached to magical and mythical creatures, and how they can be associated with landscape identity, nature protection, in this sort of way. So I guess I could start with a negative example first. So when we think about, for example, stories that we have about certain species. So in this case, maybe not magical creatures, it can be in a way, but if you think about like all the negative stories surrounding ravens or crows or corvids in general, right? And then this sort of creates the negative perception that a lot of us might hold towards these animals, right? Even though the raven didn't really do anything to us directly, right? But it can be associated with death or witches or other things that people are afraid of, right? So there's this symbolism in this species that might affect our relationship with this species and how we behave towards it, right? Whereas there are other stories then that are connected with positive aspects of nature, right? So let's say, this is kind of a stretched example maybe, but when we think about Bigfoot, because we'll go with the Pacific Northwest example, or Sasquatch.
You guys know Bigfoot? You've seen him? Okay, all right, yeah. So, yeah.
One day. I lived in the Pacific Northwest and I always hoped to see Sasquatch, but never a sighting. No, but then like how this creature, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, really becomes a part of identity in the Pacific Northwest, right? So we have sports teams named after Bigfoot, right? And he's the mascot and he runs around in his giant Bigfoot costume. Or people have stickers of, and I might be one of these people, have stickers of Sasquatch on like their water bottles or on their computer. And it's really part of the identity of being a Northwesterner, even though this is a creature that is really associated with a specific landscape type in the US. there's a culture around then this magical or mythical creature, right? Or maybe some people think Sasquatch is around and they're going to try to find him, right?
Yes.
But then we attach identity to this creature and then to the landscape more in general in this way, right? Like people aren't avoiding the forest because they're afraid of Bigfoot. He's shy. He's not going to hurt you, right? But there might be people who go into the forest who are like, oh, it gives Bigfoot vibes.
They're kind of seeking him out, yeah.
Yes. So this is maybe like two more surface level examples of stories. Of course, we can talk about like eco stories and eco criticism, but to keep it a little bit lighter today.
Yes, no, that's perfect. That's perfect. Totally. Yeah. And then, so is your like a broader recommendation here? And I don't know if like as the semester goes on and kind of in the project itself, if we may end with the idea of what should we be doing more of and what should we be maybe doing less of? In a sense, do you feel that we need more positive storytelling? We need like a Sasquatch of Swabia and stuff. There probably are some mythological, cryptozoological Southwest German things. You guys got to tell me about that. But these like in a sense is, and I could see that that is done in children's literature and film and storytelling and things, and like starting people young and having a sense of the mystery of nature. There's also this some kind of social philosophers have talked about the disenchantment of nature and how in modernity we tend to think nature's just kind of this kind of mechanical thing that we can use. It's just the forest is just a bunch of log resources waiting to be cut. It just becomes this kind of disenchanted, measurable, usable, fungible thing rather than something that has maybe again its own like kind of activity and agency, its own magic. Do you think we need just generally more of that as a culture?
In my opinion, yes. Yeah, I think that we can use stories to sort of re-enchant these landscapes, including forests, right? So re-enchant the landscapes to sort of have a different connection to them, right? See them as more than just like carbon sticks storing, carbon, right? Or chopping them down and using trees for material resources, right? And this is something that we're also exploring a little bit in our course. You talked about maybe Swabian specific, let's say crypto mythology. And in our course, we're actually in an exercise trying to develop actually new stories for new sort of novel ecosystems that we have here in Stuttgart, to try to also create this connection to, for example, green facades, right? We don't have stories from the past of mythical creatures or folklore associated with the green facade because this is a new novel sort of ecosystem that we have just in urban areas. So then how do we enchant also these new types of ecosystems, these new types of landscapes, these new types of nature that we have in urban areas? This is also part of what we're working on in the course as well. And I don't think it just has to be for children, right? We can also use this storytelling aspect. Maybe the idea of magical creatures is a bit more whimsical, right? But this storytelling aspect also for adults, right? And challenge our imagination a little bit, right? And how we can imagine these landscapes, our connection to these landscapes, and how our like relation to them in the future as well, right?
Yes, great. Yeah, and just like and that could look any number of different ways. There's like a whole prism of different possibilities that'd be kind of in the direction of a re-enchantment of nature via storytelling. And I guess I'll just mention, so with like Hobbes and Rousseau, these figures in the history of political philosophy, Thomas Hobbes, the 17th century English philosopher who's kind of very conservative in many ways, kind of represents the position of the monarchy in the English Civil War and kind of the power of the sovereign authority figure. And on this question, his view of nature, his story of nature, is that nature is this brutish, brutal, violent death space where, and the extent that humans are in nature, we're just, we're diseased, we're living in constant fear of murder from other humans. we never have any sense of security. We're just going day to day in a very precarious state. And so his whole view of what nature is, this kind of lawless, chaotic space, and that kind of plays a central role in Hobbes's very influential political theory, whereby then he says that because nature is so bad, and because humans, when we're left to nature, or when we are overly connected to nature, we ourselves are insecure and lead nasty, short, brutish lives. What we need is to move ourselves away. We need, and he sees that as happening through the social contracts and the formation of a civil society that kind of stands on its own apart from nature, and that exercises control and sovereign authority over nature, but also over other humans. But it's just a story of nature bad, therefore non-nature is where humans should go. And that you can see this then, just that kind of grounding idea, not just in Hobbes, but in centuries of political thinking and economic thinking, certainly, that still I think is going very much today, that whereby people in a sense have a certain fear of nature, or nature is seemed to be threatening, chaotic, dark. It is connected with death and our own frailty and aging, and the lack of control that we have over our lives. And there's nothing that say markets and economists like less than lack of control. It's like humans, we want to be in control. So there's still that Hobbesian story in the background very much, and it scales. But with Rousseau then, who's kind of, like a patron saint of environmentalism in many ways, his story then is that nature good, basically. Is that like humans in nature are gentle, compassionate. We're not competing with one another intrinsically. We get along with one another. There's a sort of natural, wild freedom that we can have. And so if nature is characterized as more good, and we have that story, then what does society become? Society then, which in many ways is broken with nature, the idea then where do we want to go is we need to kind of reconnect with nature. We need to reintegrate ourselves with nature, where we are overly alienated with nature. And that good nature we can bring back into our lives and bring forward. So I see, the kind of broader environmental movement, or the sustainability, or the kind of the greening, this broader kind of sense that as a species or as communities, we need to change in a certain direction. That Rousseauian story in the background, I think, is helpful for that. What I'm doing then in that class, and I kind of think where I then contribute to our project in some ways, at thinking of this, the history of philosophy in this broader scale, is just that there are these broad stories that are on a very deep level, and they're entrenched in our institutions. But there have long been alternatives. So whereas even in the case of, say, with the green facades, I really like that idea that then we need to invent new stories for that too. But it's also that we can draw on kind of ancient stories as well that amplify. And if you want to weave in kind of the importance of indigenous perspectives, I think right now it's still going on, the COP31 in Brazil, and a centerpiece of that climate action conference is the role of indigenous voices, which Brazil, as the host, has really tried to foreground. And this type of storytelling, we don't need to create everything out of reinvent the wheel. There are stories there that we can bring together with new stories, but we have to be intentional, and we have to also be critical, and critical theorists, in the sense that we need to recognize that we're already kind of swimming in this sea of bad storytelling in many ways that we need to agitate against, just as the same time where we need to get these new streams of good storytelling. But what do you think of that? I don't know. How's it?
Yeah, I mean, I can only agree, right? That yes, there is already this, instead of stream, I'm going to say pool, this pool of stories, right? And that there already is so much knowledge out there, either in story form or other form, right? And you brought in the idea of more legitimately considering indigenous knowledge, right? When we think about aspects related to climate or biodiversity, right? But then also more traditional forms of knowledge, right? That also might be more attached to people on the land, right? So also these indigenous voices, but also these like land-based voices and knowledge bases that go beyond our typical, let's say, academic Western science viewpoints here. And I think also then touching upon these stories and these knowledge, it's important to learn from this, of course, without just taking something and copying it and bringing it to our own situation. So again, I'm thinking specifically about green facades and telling stories, right? We don't want to just steal somebody else's story that has really like important cultural relevance for them and then be like, okay, now we're just going to change this and make it applicable for green facades, right? We have to dig deeper into these different types of ecosystems, into the situation that we have today, into who we are as people, right? And create these stories. And still definitely be inspired, right, by what's out there, but not just taking someone else's story and plopping it onto a new, let's say, in this case, facade, right?
Yes, yeah, literally. So, yeah, because it's like stories are then they're context dependent, and they also depend on there's a storyteller and there's listeners who maybe kind of then can continue the story. So, I guess with storytelling as well, there's a risk or a danger. I mean, I think there's a lot of power in turning to storytelling, and that's one reason I'm very excited about this project this semester, that there's so much that could be said there and positive energy. But then at the same time, the stories and defining stories and what are the right stories, it also then becomes very gray and mercurial, and the sense of defining, that there aren't a lot of clear, neat edges, which often we in academics of all stripes kind of try to seek neat boundaries. But yeah.
And I wish Felix was here, because I guess he would have a lot to say about also the dangerous use of stories in the political landscape, right? Think about Trump, for example, right?
Yes,
And I'm sure he would have a lot to say on these topics, but hopefully we dive into that a little bit in the workshop series as well.
Yes, yeah. I'll put in the show notes for those who are listening or watching in and around Stuttgart for the other public events that we'll have as well around this. And to weave in, because then Felix weaves in more the kind of beating heart and the emotional under resonance and its political potential, but also dangers for democracy, for sustainability, for all sorts. How we doing on time? I'm still a bad time guy. Perfect. Okay, so let's transition to our final phase. I don't know. Does anybody who is with us have any questions for either of us, or just comments, things you want to say to both of you guys? Perfect. Why don't, you want to begin?
I'm Human. I don't know how much deeper I should get into that. Let's just stick with that.
What's your address?
My background is architecture and technology, actually.
Okay.
Yes, but I do have this question that whenever you're referring to nature, you mentioned green spaces and blue spaces. And to me, I don't know, maybe is it a language barrier that I understand nature differently in my language? That I did not see you referring to, I don't know, deserts or rocky mountains as nature, or are there studies on that? Does it have the same value, or is that just simply not nature?
So first, you definitely could have a different understanding of what nature is, right? This is going to be related to our background and how we grew up and how we currently think today, right? So maybe you do have a different definition of nature. But I would say that deserts and mountains, yes, these are all definitely still nature. We used terms like urban green and blue spaces, I think, because these are typical vocabulary that we might use in urban planning or also architecture. So when we're thinking about translating our research from, let's say, more ecology-based work to then urban planning, architecture, we do use this terminology like green and blue spaces, right? But these green and blue spaces can be very diverse, right? There's different types of blue spaces. There's different kinds of ponds, oceans, rivers, lakes, etc., right? And these will likely have different impacts on people and our relationship to these places. And green spaces, right? This is also super broad, right? These can be forests, parks, grasslands, a combination of all of these different types of ecosystems. And then when we think we use these terms, urban, green, and blue spaces, but then there are also seasons, right? So what happens when these are now white spaces, when they're covered in snow, right? It's still nature, but the way we interact with it, the benefits that we might receive from it are still likely different, right? And this also includes things like deserts, right? Just a different type of biome or ecosystem, right? But still definitely nature.
Thanks. Yeah, because I come from Iran, and there it is actually famous that people of deserts are more hospitable and happier. And yeah, I just found that maybe it does have actually the exact same thing.
Yeah, that'd be interesting.
And I'll just quickly add one little remark is to say like the color palette. Like what is nature and what color is nature? And like green and to some sense blue, but green in particular it's almost like it gets this solitary meaning. It's like nature is green. It's like a leaf or a tree, and then if you're kind of interested in environmental things, you're like a green thinker. And we paint everything green, but really that's like a super impoverished sense of the diverse color palette of nature. Nature's all colors. Nature's also putrid, brown, rotting, dead bodies in the forest floor. And nature is, certainly in deserts, nature is like snakes and tundra and dunes. Nature is all of this, and I think we need to, maybe as an environmentalist, and when we're thinking of stories, we ought to have our stories be in kind of that full technicolor of nature. And then that it's climate dependent as well. So it's like not every urban space is going to be the same. So depending on where you are in the world and the climate and water availability and all this stuff. So there also has to be an adaptability on that scale, I suppose, right? So.
Yeah, and I would add one more thing, right? Because you mentioned the term green space is so reductive, right? And we talked about different ecosystems that can be considered green, but then you also need to think about the different species assemblages and species diversity and how all of this is different as well, right? And this is critically important when we think about ecological topics and climate change. So not just green, but what is comprising this green, right? And I'm really glad you pointed that out because this was a bit reductive in our phrasing. Right?
Yeah, no, it's a great example. Yeah, we're going to cite you. Yeah, just your first name. Yeah. Ivo, do you want to jump in as well? I don't know.
Hey, my name is Ivo, and I also do philosophy. And I had a question regarding your optimism. You seem like a very optimistic person. And I wanted to ask about optimism in regard to ecological collapse, or also the story of human extinction, that we may be parts of the last generations, and also the role of anthropocentrism and all of that. So what are your thoughts navigating these kinds of stories?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's probably cautious optimism, right? So it's easy for me, or I need to be, right, optimistic about maybe more of these smaller pieces of the story, right? And in general, I do have optimism and cautious optimism for the future as well. And I think I personally, at least, need this optimism so that I can envision the goal, right? So I can envision this better future and discover how I can work towards this, or how we can work towards this as academics, as teachers, as researchers, as people, right, living in cities. And personally, again, I can't answer for everyone, right? But personally for me, I do need this at least cautious optimism so that I can envision this future where I want to live, where we can live, where we've solved issues like biodiversity loss, and we've addressed issues related to climate change. And starting then from this desirable future and thinking about, okay, how do we get there? And working towards it. And then for me, as long as I know that I'm trying to work towards it, it helps keep that optimism. Because it can be kind of hard, right? And I don't want to be unrealistic or something either, right? And I do work with these topics, like I said, every day, let's say, negative impacts of climate change, the negative impacts of biodiversity loss. And if I wasn't optimistic or if I couldn't envision a better future, I don't think I'd be able to work in this field.
Mm-hmm.
But having an idea of this better future and then starting from that point of, okay, how do we work towards it? That I find very constructive.
Yeah, thanks. Great answer.
How do you feel about these things?
Well, I'm teaching philosophy with kids at a high school, and they're also trying to talk about these topics. It's a bit challenging for me because I understand that the future will be a bit more challenging than it's been in the past. There's a lot of change, and talking to young children about these topics and giving them an awareness for this ecological perspective is can be challenging at times without disillusioning them or and I liked your point about re-enchanting nature, and that I think that's also one opening way for envisioning a new relation to nature.
Yeah, and even though we have such heavy, difficult things that we're working through right now, right? Thinking about re-enchanting, thinking about ways that we can teach about and connect with these topics in a more positive manner, right? And I think also part of it, because I imagine working with young people, this might be very difficult without trying to like increase their eco-anxiety or something, right? Being like, you're the next generation, you have to deal with this. And I think a lot of it is bringing the responsibility back to us, right? And doing what we can do so that we're not raising this next generation of people with eco-anxiety of, okay, this is your problem, you have to deal with it, right?
Yeah.
But, yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Hope springs eternal, right? You know, that's what they
Yes.
say. So, well, we've come to the time where I'm going to ask you if you have anything to recommend for viewers, listeners, and those of us here. 3 recommendations: book, film, album, mix and match your choice, related to what we've talked about or otherwise. Do you have anything to share for us?
Yes, and I
With us?
came prepared. I brought props. So I brought 2 books with me. This first one is called Reconnection by Miles Richardson. And it's really a lot about what we talked today about. So like, how can we improve this human-nature connection? What benefits can this bring? And how can we do this from both top-down and bottom-up sort of methodologies? So a very nice book by Miles Richardson. The second one is From What Is to What If by Rob Hopkins. And this fits really well with our topic of stories for a better future. And it's all about learning how to reimagine a better future and the future that we want. And he actually has a new book out called Falling in Love with the Future. I've bought it, but I haven't had time to read it yet. But it's at home and it's sitting on my desk. I can't recommend it yet because I haven't read it, but I can definitely recommend this one. And the last one I would recommend is not a book. I'll go for an album. A little bit unrelated to our topic today, but I would say Good News for People Who Love Bad News from Modest Mouse. It was definitely my teenage angst album. And it does sound kind of pessimistic, and it is a relatively pessimistic album, actually. But in comparison to their earlier work, it actually shows like a slight increase of optimism. And I like that because it shows that even like these people who were like, okay, yeah, they're pessimists, can also change their opinion on things. And in some of the later songs deal with topics of like letting go of things that don't serve us in our present anymore or the future that we want to have.
Okay, wonderful.
So maybe that shows my age a little bit.
No, it's great, yeah. No, I remember that one, and I'm going to look that up on Spotify right after this. So, thanks very, very much.
Thank you.
Fantastic, yeah. So, yeah, we'll have to chat again. I mean, we will obviously chat again, but maybe we can do another pod in the spring or something to debrief and see if we were successful in kind of changing the world and improving things with storytelling or not. But I really appreciate you being here and joining us here at the museum. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, then everybody, we'll see y'all soon. Thanks again, and adios, auf Wiedersehen. And thanks to Marie and everybody from the Museum Hegel-Haus family for sponsoring this event and stuff. So, and this episode will come out on after the festival is already done, but I'll just mention that there's a lot going on at the Hegel-Haus today and over these past few days, and there's always something going on at the Hegel-Haus. So do check out the website, and we'll see y'all later on.
Thank you.
Okay, that's a wrap. Okay. The Deadbeat Philosophy Podcast is a co-production of Deadbeat Media and the Museum Hegel-Haus, Stuttgart. For more Deadbeat content and to chip in to keep the channel going, check us out at deadbeatphilosophy.substack.com. For more about the Museum Hegel-Haus, check out hegelhaus.de. That's HEGEL-HAUS.de. Adios and auf Wiedersehen.